We know mixed martial arts is an honorable game. Fighters glove touch, they don't cheat, and above all, they certainly don't take performance-enhancing drugs. But every now and then, a fighter comes along bursting with aggression, muscle, and testosterone. In an already hyper-masculine sport, certain fighters stand head and shoulders above the rest, and it makes the MMA community question whether they're clean or not. So these are the most obvious UFC fighters who use steroids. Forget MMA, Brock Lesnar is one of the most athletic people of all time.
For his size, he's 310 pounds. He's the best athlete I've ever been in a ring with. I mean, he's explosive, he's quick, he's fast, he's strong as hell.
As a high school wrestler, a WWE entertainer, and a UFC fighter, the jury has been out on Brock Lesnar as a clean athlete since day one. Even before his days as a professional wrestler, the signs of Lesnar being a steroid user have been there. He was arrested in his mid-20s for supposedly having a large amount of steroids. It later turned out to be human growth hormone, which, while isn't illegal, would fail any drug test when it comes to sports. And then within the pro wrestling world, steroid use is very commonplace, particularly in Lesnar's prime.
One of the top officials come up to me and he didn't outright say, hey, we're gonna need you to get on this. What he told me was, have you thought about talking to some of the boys about that creatine that they're on?
And while he actually went the majority of his career without failing a test, everyone would have bet their house on Lesnar having used some substances throughout his life. One of the main reasons why he never failed the test may be due to the fact he was a part-time wrestler for big chunks of his career. That meant he wasn't a part of the WWE wellness program that is the primary way for spotting steroid use. But it all came to a head at UFC 200 when at 38 years old, Lesnar was returning to fighting after a 5-year layoff. In the build-up to the UFC's biggest event of all time, he just looked insanely jacked for someone his age. Everyone had their suspicions, and even more so when he was given an exemption by USADA to not enter the testing pool for numerous months before a competition.
The UFC granted Brock Lesnar a special exemption on drug testing, which is insane.
What?
What? If you could.
And at UFC 200, Lesnar was far too powerful and explosive for his opponent Mark Hunt. But as many expected, it was announced the following month that Brock had tested positive for 2 estrogen blockers. They're substances that are often used after a steroid cycle to get your testosterone production back on track. Almost everyone involved in MMA and even beyond knew something wasn't right.
Biggest fucking embarrassment of the year.
Why would that be?
Embarrassment, bro.
What was embarrassing?
Just embarrassing against Mark Hunt. They knew he was on the juice. He went in there loaded to the gills. It was just an embarrassing fucking thing. It was an embarrassing thing for everybody. And Mark Hunt had every fucking right to be mad. They put him in there with a guy that's coming off rocket fucking fuel. That dude just don't eat D-ball. Look at the size of his fucking head. He's taking shit that makes your fucking head grow.
As a result, Mark Hunt is still trying to sue the UFC with claims that they knew Lesnar had failed a test prior to the UFC 200, but stayed quiet about it. And from one juiced-up savage to another, this is the story of Vitor Belfort and the infamous testosterone loophole. Vitor Belfort first appeared in the UFC all the way back in UFC 12 in 1997. Even as a teenager, he looked like a bodybuilder. Of course, there wasn't drug testing back then, but at least on the eye, it looked like Vitor must have been on something. And while he tested positive for elevated testosterone levels during his pride days in the mid-2000s, Vitor's big run-in with the performance-enhancing drugs was with the UFC. Vitor was at the forefront of one of the most controversial parts of the UFC's history, known as the TRT era. The story goes that fighters discovered a loophole in the UFC's drug testing at the time and exploited it.
Was for fighters to go to a doctor and get a letter to say that this fighter needs testosterone replacement therapy because his testosterone is low. Do you know what happens if you take a lot of steroids when you're in your prime, when you don't really need it? It affects your natural production of testosterone. So these people that were cheating throughout the course of their career, which affected their natural production of testosterone, were then getting rewarded because they would go to a doctor and they say, yeah, he's got low testosterone. Here you go, here's some more.
They'd somehow get their testosterone levels to plummet, some claimed through actual steroid use, then go to a doctor complaining about how they feel lethargic, weak, alongside a bunch of other symptoms. A doctor would check and discover they had extremely low testosterone levels and give them testosterone replacement therapy, which the athletic commissions would approve.
It's a loophole. It's you know, I'm not saying that there aren't guys that probably need this testosterone therapy, but there's probably some guys that don't. And the guys that do should be taking exactly enough to get them to normal levels.
Then they'd fight in the UFC while oozing with testosterone despite being in the latter stages of their careers.
But
do you believe he was on something for that camp or for that fight?
Oh, he was. There's no way your testosterone is at 1200 at 38 years old. That's just insane. But then the other thing is he's not failing because the way they test is through the epitestosterone to testosterone ratio, which I found that you can manipulate. So I'm thinking that he was manipulating that.
And that is the legend of TRT Vitor. In 2013 alone, Vitor head-kicked and finished a prime Michael Bisping, Luke Rockhold, and Dan Henderson. Bear in mind, Vitor was 36 at the time and had been competing for 17 years in MMA. Yet, out of nowhere, he was more jacked than ever and as fast as he'd ever been. Whether it was the extra testosterone or not, but Vitor Belfort cost Michael Bisping his eye when they fought.
Vitor, or was it already damaged going into the fight?
No, it wasn't, because you get your eyes tested.
Okay.
So yeah, no, he kicked me in the head. He was juiced out to the max. I mean, you could take one look at the guy.
Kicked me in the head too.
Yeah, no, it was at that same time. It was me,
him, Dan Henderson,
Rich Franklin,
AJ,
Dan Henderson, AJ,
Anthony Johnson.
Yeah.
I think Anthony Johnson was the starter.
He went on this crazy run.
Anthony Johnson,
all the fights were in Brazil. He was like bloody King Kong.
All 3 fights were in Brazil, where the testing was far more relaxed, because when he was set to fight for the UFC title in America, he failed a drug test for elevated T levels, and after returning and actually competing for the title, he didn't look like that same monster we saw in Brazil. After that, Vitor's career fizzled out in the UFC, but the legend of TRT Vitor will never be forgotten. And speaking of legends who may have taken an extra supplement or two, let's talk about the man who literally ran from a drug test, Wanderlei Silva. When you think of Wanderlei Silva, a few words probably come to mind: aggression, ruthlessness, power.
Everybody was terrified of Wanderlei.
I didn't know
That's
that.
why they called him the Axe Murderer. That was his nickname.
I didn't know that.
Wanderlei would just stare at you like this and do this shit with his hands before the fights. And everybody's like, oh, this fucking guy.
All things synonymous with PED users. And in Pride during the mid-2000s when Wanderlei was dominant, the organization definitely wasn't checking for steroids.
In Japan, they didn't test for steroids. I remember in the rules meeting, they give you like a little the sheet of paper, tells you all the rules. The first thing on the paper was like, we do not test for anabolic steroids. Yeah.
In fact, some of the former fighters claim that Pride actually encouraged their fighters to take PEDs. So everyone during that Pride era has a slight asterisk next to their name. And for Silva, this isn't where the story ends. Prior to his grudge match with Chael Sonnen, news broke that Wanderlei had literally run away from a drug test.
The way the story was told is that Wanderlei just turned and ran. Well, that wasn't true. He stood his ground and talked to this guy for a while. He said, get on the phone with an attorney, prove to me who you are. He did all of these things, and then finally said, look, I got to get to a press conference. I'm leaving. Got in his car and drove right to the MGM for the press conference.
In his defense, drug testing was completely new for many of these athletes, and let's just say, there were a lot of teething problems.
They show up, the guy has no ID, absolutely no identification of who he is. I think that's a problem to start with.
It's a huge problem. That's a huge problem.
He then wants to take me into a back room, which ended up being a janitor's closet, not sanitary, a back room at the MGM Grand. He takes me in there where I must derobe and present to him my penis because he watches. You know, now that's a very private thing.
And in the eyes of the Nevada State Athletic Commission, running away is as good as failing. So in response, they gave Wanderlei an unprecedented punishment, a life sentence from MMA and a $70,000 fine. Wanderlei later admitted to running because he was using diuretics at the time and didn't want to test positive for them. He claimed it was to help inflammation and flush water out of his system, but diuretics are also used to get steroids out of someone's system quickly so that they can pass a drugs test. Thankfully for Wanderlei, the commission reduced the sentence to 3 years and scrapped the fine. But even so, Silva was in his late 30s at the time and never fought for the UFC again. And from perhaps the most aggressive fighter of all time to the most jacked, Yoel Romero.
Athletic freak.
The
rarest of the rare.
I used to kick this guy in like the fucking in the leg or the fucking form, and everybody that he's fought always says it, you know. And you saw his performance with Izzy. I think he hit Izzy in the first round. Izzy kept like touching it because he truly is the most dense guy I've ever worked out with.
That's what Luke Rockhold said. He was like he was made out of metal.
Bro, it's not a fucking lie, bro.
In modern MMA, there probably isn't an athlete as explosive, powerful, and intimidating as Yoel Romero. He has insane flexibility, moves like a flyweight, and all his opponents say he's made of steel.
When I was punching and kicking him, he felt like metal, like a dude made out of concrete. It was ridiculous.
And the steroid accusations have followed Romero throughout his career.
Who made that? Yeah, who made that? I don't know, but it's fucking great.
Eddie sent that to us today. We're fucking crying.
Howling. I did not make that.
No, but you sent it.
I did not make that.
You did make it.
I don't even agree with it.
I agree with it.
I sent it to
I agree with it.
This
and
is
it worked for
private.
the UFC. I agree with it.
But outside of one mishap that wasn't his fault, Yoel has never failed a test. And considering he's competed at the Olympics, World Championships, Pan American Championships, and more, he's probably been tested for the majority of his life. Romero just claims that the Cuban people have wild genetics.
Come to Cuba for maybe 20 days. I wanted the people to see, because the genetic for Cuba,
off the charts.
Even so, doctors who have looked after Romero claim they've never seen an athlete like it in their lives.
The doctors brought Yoel in. Yoel had like a fracture in his orbital. They bring him in, and the doctor calls Dana and goes, this is the most unusual human being I have ever seen. And Dana's like, oh yeah, he's a great athlete. You know, how's the eye doing? The doctor goes, no, Dana, I don't mean from an athletic standpoint. I mean from 40 years in practice. I've never seen a human being like this. And then begin to break down, medically speaking, the things that were unique about Yoel.
But in the midst of his UFC career, Yoel Romero tested positive for a growth hormone stimulator and was suspended for 6 months by USADA. The MMA community wasn't surprised, but there was much more to his story than meets the eye. In an era where every PED user in the UFC blames a tainted supplement, it looks like Romero did nothing wrong intentionally. Both the supplement he had and an unopened version of it tested positive for the same substance that Romero did.
Who knows how long he was taking this supplement for? You know, he could have been taking this for years, I'm assuming so. When you look at his physique, you know, he certainly has a splendid physique, and good for him. And it turns out that he was taking performance-enhancing drugs.
But in the end, Romero took the company to court, sued them for millions of dollars, and cleared his name in the process. Even so, if you ask any MMA fan if they think Romero has taken some legal supplements at some point in his life, the majority would say yes. And a fighter in a similar boat but on the female side of MMA is Cris Cyborg. Of course, females naturally don't carry as much muscle as men, but Cris Cyborg is one of the very few exceptions. She's probably the most muscular female fighter in UFC history, and definitely right near the top when it comes to power and aggression.
Doesn't seem to lose. She's just smashing people. She's got really good technique, and she's super powerful, and she's really big, and she's got a lot of success.
Even before her UFC days, Cyborg was a known steroid user. Back in Strikeforce, she tested positive for an anabolic steroid and was banned from the sport for an entire year. And whether it was her fighting style, deeper voice, or the fact that she was a female, Cyborg received a lot of criticism over the years.
I said, when I saw her at the MMA Awards, she looked like Wanderlei Silva in a dress and heels.
Other fighters can test positive and all is forgiven, but for Cyborg, being a drug cheat followed her everywhere.
She tested positive for a serious steroid, and something that you're like, a woman taking a steroid is different than a man taking a steroid.
I'm with you. If you're pumped full of steroids and the lightest you can get is 145, then if you're clean, it's assumed that you could get lighter.
Even in the UFC under USADA's stringent testing, her reputation still haunted her. The women's featherweight champion Germaine de Randamie flat out refused a fight with Cris Cyborg due to her history with PEDs.
We discussed that she being caught with the diuretics, and diuretics are also being used sometimes as blockers for other stuff in your system. We decided not to take the fight, not only because of the steroid thing or me thinking that people, me being against people that abuse substances. It was also, I was not going to be able to be ready at July 29th.
But of course, a lot of people just believed she didn't want to take the fight. But Cyborg had tested positive for a diuretic not that long prior. USADA actually gave her an exemption after discovering her physician had prescribed it due to a health issue Cyborg was having. Whether that's suspicious or not, you can decide for yourselves. But either way, there's no hiding that Cris Cyborg is one of the most obvious cases of a UFC fighter who has used PEDs in their career at one point or another. And another fighter whose physique gave it away is Alistair Overeem. His debut UFC fight against Brock Lesnar is probably, to this day, the battle between the two most jacked guys in history.
They were doing a smell test back then for steroids. That's all they did. They're like, yeah, you're good. Everybody passed. It's so ridiculous. When you look at Brock Lesnar and he's standing right next to, like, look at the two of them. How the fuck did he pass anything? They used to call him Overeem back then because, like, he wasn't like a real person.
Yeah.
He was like a comic book superhero.
Yeah.
His physique was perfect, and his kickboxing skills world class, dude. I mean, K1 Grand Prix champion. When they didn't test, or when they tested very lightly, Alistair was running the show.
Overeem was already a beast of a man while fighting in Pride, but it felt like he doubled in size in just a couple of years. So much so that the MMA community even has a nickname for Alistair when he was at his biggest, Overeem. And coincidence or not, but just a few months after the Lesnar fight, Overeem failed a drug test for elevated testosterone levels. He claimed it was due to an anti-inflammatory that a doctor prescribed him, but this was never proven. While Overeem was getting older, his body began to drastically deteriorate, especially once USADA testing became a thing in the UFC. After leaving the UFC, Overeem had one more fight, a glory kickboxing bout, and after the event he tested positive for an undisclosed banned substance. Nowadays, the man notorious for eating horse meat to bulk up has essentially turned vegan and could probably make middleweight if he wanted. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, Conor McGregor has only gotten bigger and bigger over the years, with a lot of people suspecting steroids may be behind it. For the vast majority of his career, no one has suspected McGregor of ever using PEDs. He's always been in amazing shape, but nothing out of the ordinary for a UFC fighter. That all changed though after his gruesome leg break.
I certainly support guys taking things to recover from injuries like Conor did with his leg injury. 100%. No question about it. I'm 100% all in on that.
He voluntarily dropped out of the UFC's drug testing protocol in the aftermath, which definitely raised some suspicion. And while that may have been due to the fact that he wasn't going to be competing anytime soon, and having people randomly trying to take your urine is super annoying, there's another train of thought.
It just bugs me that he gets to jump out of the pool, juice up on whatever he's juiced on, and then just jump back in the pool and no one's going to say shit about it.
The theory is that McGregor was taking some form of steroid or performance enhancer to help him recover quicker from the leg injury. In total, he wasn't drug tested for over 2 years, and in that time, he put on a huge amount of muscle.
Your ability to do cardio goes down, so obviously when Conor was limping around for the better part of a year after 2 snapped bones, he was naturally going to gain weight, but yeah, how big his face got.
Yeah, but you're not getting
his
like a
upper
Barry
body.
Bonds chin.
Yeah, I
and
mean, like
you
the
know.
dude. Some of those photos, you know, you can't help but to think, man, are they photoshopped because it's that drastic, or you know,
jacked.
He'd probably struggle to make lightweight given just how big he is. Of course, this is purely speculation, but a lot of people have accused McGregor of using PEDs. It'll likely remain a mystery forever, but given his drastic change outside of the octagon, fans can't deny that a lot of the signs are there. And speaking of outside the octagon, sometimes UFC fighters' rivalries are so strong that the violence happens at a press conference, an arena, or even in the streets. We made a deep dive covering the times UFC fighters settled their beef outside of the octagon, and you can watch it here.